So thank you very much for asking me to come and speak. And today I'm going to talk to you about some ongoing work and then a kind of plan for a future fellowship. So cancer is complex as regards to sex and gender, and you can see here there's lots of factors that play a role both in incidence and outcomes. And for the trans community, this also intersects with access to gender affirming care, so hormones and surgeries, and the discrimination that they face. And this leads to issues all the way through the cancer pathway. And the important thing here is to say that actually the trans population makes up 1% of the population overall, but disclosure is rising. So it's around 2.4% in like younger age groups. So we need to think a little bit more about how we're caring for these individuals. So it's difficult to look at the epidemiology of cancers in this population because we don't record gender identity different to the sex in the medical record. And we don't record when people are trans in the medical record and they get a new NHS number. And there's also incomplete coding when you use trans status as a diagnostic code in the GP or secondary care record. And when you do have it, you don't always have linked information to gender affirming treatments or the sex someone was assigned at birth because that NHS record is new. But what do we know given these kind of issues that we have? So a lot of our data at the moment comes from Amsterdam. So the Dutch are able to link their pathology database with their gender affirming care clinic. And we see a lower incidence of breast cancers in both trans women and trans men compared to cis women, but not that much lower as you might expect. And actually the rate in trans women of breast cancer is about 50 times more than it would be in a cisgender man. So hormones do raise that risk. There's a lower incidence of prostate cancer compared to cis men because of the hormones that we use, which are also kind of treatment for prostate cancer. And there's no difference in testicular cancers, and the gynecological cancer data is about to be presented this weekend. And what about non-sex or gender-related cancers? So this is work by a collaborator of mine, Sarah Jackson, from a US database, which shows that there's a greater proportion of cancers related to HIV, smoking, and other risk factors related to minority stress in the trans population. And she also saw a lower incidence of prostate cancer. And a similar pattern of kind of viral-driven cancers was also seen in another study of the US database. And this fits with what we have managed to see in the UK. So this is work I did with Sarah a couple of years ago, where we used CPRD, GOLD and ORAM and data on people's gender affirming care, as well as a diagnostic code of being trans or gender diverse, in order to try to work out who was trans in the medical record, which was not straightforward. And we came up with a cohort of around about 7,000 trans people. And you can see that many risk factors for cancer, such as smoking, alcohol use, diabetes, obesity and viral status, were all significantly increased in the trans population. I've mentioned it's really hard to work out how many cancers there are because this isn't recorded in secondary care, and so we have no record in the cancer registry of how many trans people are getting cancer. And so an ongoing project at the moment is to combine census and GPPS data to work out a population estimate for trans people and combine that with data on cancer incidence in the cis population from the registration, and then to augment that with things like the lifestyle risk factor data I just showed you, the incidence of gendered cancers that I showed you from Amsterdam, and then also access to gender affirming care, which again is not well recorded in the medical record. So we rely on a population survey to at least get some sort of predicted incidence of cancer for this population, and that work is ongoing at the moment. So how can we make a difference to the kind of treatment and care of patients through the pathway? So I'll show you one ongoing study at the moment. So HPV-related cancers are of particular burden for the trans population. They exhibit some risk factors and increased abundance that might lead to persistence of HPV, which is the virus that causes cervical cancer, as well as a number of other cancers, including anal cancer and oral cancer. Data from other countries shows that the prevalence rate in trans men is around about the same as for cis women, but for trans women there's a huge variation by geography, and depending on how many of those that participated in the study had comorbid HIV. And we know that trans men are less likely to be up to date with screening or have an adequate screen because they face lots of barriers in the screening process, particularly in the UK, where they might be registered with a male gender marker and are not automatically recalled, or they may face dysphoria during the screening process. So this is a study that we've got running at the moment through Queen Mary, and it's recruiting at 3 sites. So this is a HPV self-testing pilot where we're not just testing for cervical HPV in trans men, but we're testing trans women as well, and we're looking at oral HPV and anal HPV. And the primary outcome is to assess acceptability and feasibility, with the aim of them rolling out a much larger study in the future to try to work out prevalence. We're aiming to recruit 50 trans men and 50 trans women, and there's in-clinic sampling for the cervical screen for trans men and also an at-home component for trans women. And we're about 30 patients through our target recruitment of 100 at the moment. So then to move forward and to what I'd like to look at more in my fellowship, so thinking a little bit more about treatment. So the treatment, and particularly of hormone-related cancers, does need a little bit of careful thought for trans patients. So for example, in trans women and those who are assigned male at birth, the question if they're on feminizing hormones is when to begin screening, because it's all about the amount of estrogen that they may have been exposed to, and also the amount of progesterone. So that Dutch data that I showed you that showed the rate of breast cancer in trans women was about 3 times less than for cis women, was in a population that were taking much more progesterone, which is implicated in breast cancer risk, than is taken by any trans women in the UK. And then when these individuals develop estrogen receptor positive breast cancer, what we do about stopping their estrogen. In trans men, it's even more complex. So testosterone can be metabolized to estrogen, and it can also act on the androgen receptor to stimulate tumors. And it works differently depending on the other receptors present in that tumor. And there's no good data set to look at long-term outcomes. We also use anti-estrogen treatment in hormone receptor positive breast cancers, and there's a balance here about which kind of treatment we use, whether we block receptors or whether we block that change of testosterone to estrogen, and how well that might work. So where do we go from here in order to get this information, because nowhere in the world is collecting it at the moment? Well, I came up with the idea to design a fellowship proposal that I hope to submit in the next 12 months. And I think any of this work needs to be carefully designed with the community. So Transcript was a small grant funded for patient and public involvement by QMUL, where we ran some focus groups along with Outpatients, which is an LGBTQ cancer charity, and we recruited patients through them and also through my clinic, which is the UK Cancer and Transition Service, which is a tertiary referral service that reviews trans patients with cancer. And we had a focus group for idea generation. We undertook some reflection and developed the work packages, and then we got review of the work packages. And this is the project which is provisionally titled that we came up with, which is Encrypt, which is enabling cancer research and personalised treatment for the trans and gender diverse population. And just to show you what that might look like. So the overarching aim is to improve the evidence base for cancer care and for trans and gender diverse people. And there are a number of research questions. So actually, what are the clinical unknowns? We found in the PPI that actually the questions that patients were asking, clinicians didn't know the answer to, and sometimes clinicians didn't even know what they didn't know. What's the impact of gender affirming hormones on quality of life and on cancer outcomes? What are the intersecting inequalities? How should we change our management? And actually, could we think about a bit more carefully about the molecular changes in these cancers in order to better think about treatment? And my background and my PhD was genomics, but obviously there's no good way to get samples in order to kind of do this very careful work. So these are what the work packages might look like. So work package 1, which we called Mind the Gap, is to identify those gaps in knowledge and to determine where people go looking for that information, so that not only can we generate the information, but we know where to put it so that healthcare professionals and patients can get it. And the method here would be a set of qualitative interviews with trans and gender diverse patients and their healthcare professionals. And then we would be able to further develop the research questions for further on in this kind of mixed methods project, and also produce patient resources. Big data would use existing data sets like CPRD and the trans cohort that I've already spoken about, along with Open Safely, in order to kind of look at outcomes and incidents in the same way as Tahania has already looked at for ethnicity. And finally, building a cohort that prospectively recruits through that UCATS clinic that I mentioned, and is able to longitudinally follow patients and also pilot biobanking.